Good morning. My name is Leslie Baum, and I'm the co-chair of today's event, along with author Michael Bonesteel, Scott Hunter, and the University of Chicago, and Deborah Carr of Intuit. Thank you for joining us in person and online for the second of our 3-session symposium series, Artists First Conversations, held in conjunction with the exhibition Artists First, 25 Years of Studio Art at Thresholds, currently on display downstairs in the Michigan Avenue Gallery's first floor east. Don't miss it. This event would not be possible without the support of Kyoko Lerner and the Nathan and Kyoko Lerner Foundation, along with additional support from Intuit, the Center for Intuitive and Outsider Art, and its 2022 grant funding from the National Endowment for the Arts. Our thanks also go to our partners, the Chicago Department of Cultural Affairs and Special Events and Thresholds. Our panelists will be addressing questions from both the in-house and online audience at the end of the session. Please feel free to write down your questions on the cards being passed along the aisle, which will be collected toward the end of the formal presentations, or submit your online questions via the chat function on Zoom. Our session moderator today is Dr. Sonya Mathies Dinizulu. Sonya Mathies Dinizulu, PhD, is a licensed clinical psychologist, art therapist, educator, researcher, consultant, and public speaker. She is currently an associate professor in psychiatry and behavioral neuroscience at the University of Chicago Medical Center. Dr. Dinizulu specializes in using art-based and psychotherapeutic techniques with children, adolescents, young adults, and families exposed to trauma and violence. She provides anti-racist and trauma-informed responsive services using a socio-ecological and social justice framework, particularly for marginalized and underserved youth facing chronic stressors, such as community violence. Dr. Dinizulu is committed to advocating and promoting recovery and empowerment for youth and families affected by violence and systematic inequities through various mechanisms. Her research focuses on mental health promotion and developing innovative community-based, trauma-informed, and culturally responsive services and interventions for Black youth and families exposed to violence. She has been featured as an expert in several investigative pieces written by NPR, Chicago Sun-Times, and Chicago Tribune, published peer-reviewed studies, and presents locally and nationally about the impact of community violence, racial, historical, and generational trauma on youth and families. Welcome, Sonya.
Okay, I think we're going to start with our introductions of our panelists. And I believe the first one is going to be, it's you? Okay. I'm sorry, I'm not aware of what the slide presentations are. Okay. So each of us, just to give people a heads up, we're going to do about 5 to 10 minutes introductions of each of our panelists, and then we'll go into some questions that I have for the panelists, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. Seems good? Okay.
Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Katherine Jentleson, but you can call me Katie, and I'm the Merrie and Dan Boone Curator of Folk and Self-Taught Art at the High Museum of Art in Atlanta. And I wanted to introduce myself by way of this introductory slide. It's a kind of image of one of the exteriors of our buildings. For those of you who haven't been, the High has, for many years, been a major art museum in the southeastern United States, and I hope that you all will think of us when you're coming through the South, and also when you have a layover at Hartsfield-Jackson, because we're actually only like a 20-minute ride on the train from the airport terminal to the museum, so you can just pop in and back down. And since I'm the only curator who's coming from really a different kind of region of the United States, I just wanted to give you a little bit of a sense of what we do at the High Museum, so you know kind of where I'm entering this conversation from. So our museum is a general museum in the sense that it actually has 7 curatorial departments: African art, European art, modern and contemporary art, photography. And then we also have a folk and self-taught art department. And this has been true for the High since the 1990s, which was a point in time when there were a lot of exhibitions and kind of a growing interest in the work of self-taught artists, so artists who didn't get a formal artistic education, but nonetheless.
I'm going to reshare something. All right, sorry.
Okay.
Sorry, Katie. Yeah.
That looks more normal now. I think our virtual audiences were getting a weird screen. So as I was saying, we are very unique in that we're really the only general interest museum in the country that has a dedicated department, which includes a collection of more than 1,200 objects, and a very busy exhibition program dedicated to the work of self-taught artists. And so I'm showing you some galleries that feature the work of artists especially. We really do focus on artists who base their practice in the southeastern United States, where we are. But you can see this, again, these galleries are on view basically 365 days a year. So anytime you happen to be in Atlanta, you'll be able to get a great kind of view into our collection. And so this focus has included historically, and now it's not advancing though. There we go. Let me go back one. This focus on self-taught artists has always been inclusive of artists who have different mental health or developmental disabilities. And I'm showing you a slide of 2 works in our collection from artists who you probably know, like Martín Ramirez and Marlon Mullen. But when I was thinking about entering this conversation today, I was really thinking about some projects that I've been working on recently and that are for exhibitions that I'm going to be involved in the next few years. Because what was striking to me is that throughout the kind of field of folk and self-taught art that we're engaged in at the High, in addition to these kinds of developmental and cognitive disabilities, you see so many artists whose trajectories are really defined by their relationship to physical disability. And it's often something that's not foregrounded in the presentations or histories of their work. And so I wanted to talk about very briefly 2 artists who you may not have known about their relationship. You may not know them at all. And if you do, you may not know that they had a very significant relationship to physical disability. That includes David Drake, who is an artist that was working in the American stoneware industry that was created in the 19th century in the old Edgefield district of South Carolina. And this was basically a kind of stoneware industry that was born through the labor of enslaved people like David Drake. And there's an exhibition right now at the Metropolitan Museum of Art called Hear Me Now, and I'm showing you a little catalog cover of that image. It's an exhibition that'll be at the Met through January, and then it's traveling around the country, so you may have the opportunity to see it there or at one of its other venues, including the High. And what it's really doing is kind of revealing just how layered and on an industrial scale the production of these kinds of pots were in the 19th century. And David Drake is one of the only potters who was in a position both being literate at a time when it was illegal for Black people in the United States to be able to read and write. He was able to not only write his name on his pots, but he also wrote poetry on them as a kind of act of resistance. And I'm showing you a kind of detail here of a pot in our collection where he's saying, I made this from salt, it will never rot. And so he's making these different kind of statements of permanence and really just kind of taking ownership over his production. And David Drake was somebody who, he was literate because of part of his labor while he was enslaved also was for a newspaper. And so he was a typesetter, and that is part of how he gained literacy. And then he became one of the most prominent potters at this time, not only because he was able to sign and write these verses on his pots, But because he actually was an amputee and he had suffered an accident that we don't really have all of the details of, but he lost one leg, which meant that he was not engaged or forced to engage in the kind of labor that went into the other kinds of dimensions of production of Edgefield pottery. So I'm showing you a site of a former Edgefield kiln on the left, and that gives you a sense of how gigantic these kilns were. They required so much labor, so many different kinds of labor to function. And I'm showing you on the right a kind of historical reconstruction of what the kiln would have looked like. And it gives you kind of a sense of how many people were involved in the kind of felling of trees and the firing of the kiln. And that was not labor that David was forced to do because he was unable to do it. And instead, he had a kind of permanent seat at the wheel. So for him, this kind of relationship to physical disability was really something that created the space where he was able to become one of the most well-known potters of this era. The other artist that I wanted to mention is someone who probably you've never heard of, George Varanovsky. We're doing the first major exhibition of his work at the High this spring. He's a Ukrainian-American artist who came to the United States after World War II. He was among the thousands of Ukrainians who was interned for being a Soviet national, not for being Jewish. He wasn't actually Jewish during World War II, was separated from his family at that time, suffered significant trauma, spent many years in displaced persons camps, and then eventually came to the United States, where he settled first in Philadelphia, and then after a workplace injury where he damaged and really lost the ability to use his legs in a normal way, he moved to South Beach, Florida, because for him, after receiving diagnoses from his doctors that he would need to amputate his legs, he kind of took matters into his own hands and decided that he would try first a kind of regimen of soaking his legs in the salt water of the Atlantic every day. And this actually did really help him, and he was able to maintain his legs through the kind of duration of his life. And he spent a lot of time on the beach. That's him on the beach watching the birds, and birds were a major feature of the paintings that he made during this period of his life. But he also made many other kinds of things. So on the left is a painting. In the middle is a painted carved styrofoam sculpture. Because he was spending so much time on the beach in South Beach of this era, he was finding that there were a lot of discarded things like the lids and containers of old styrofoam coolers or surfboards, and he used that as a kind of new media for his art. And so on the far right is just one image. This is just really a sliver of the installation of art that he created in his room. He lived long-term in a hotel that still exists on Ocean Avenue in South Beach called the Colony Hotel. He lived there for most of the last 10 years of his life and installed his paintings as well as just hundreds of carved and painted styrofoam sculptures in this really incredible way in his room. And this was done, as a kind of, I think, counterbalance to the trauma that he had experienced in his life and the kind of itinerancy that he'd been forced into as a displaced person. So creating this mark that was totally his in this place that he could call his own in the last decade of his life was also kind of a response to all of the challenges that he'd face. So that's just what I wanted to share with you. Those are some of the projects that I'm working on, some of the things that I'm thinking about, and I look forward to our conversation as it progresses. Thank you.
Good. Hi, so my name's Laura Bickford, and I'm a curator at the John Michael Kohler Art Center. And I guess curators' minds here are similar. I'm starting off with some images of the exterior of the two properties of the museum that I work at. And I wanted to follow Katie because I think I just wanted to introduce myself, provide some context for some of the work that I have done recently, and then kind of put that into context of the institution that I work at and our history of exhibition and collecting to sort of frame how I will approach this conversation. And I think the reason I was invited to be on this panel was because of a project that I just concluded that was a retrospective of the organization Creative Growth, which is in Oakland, California. And it was started in 1974 by a husband and wife duo. One was an artist, one was a psychologist. And after the mass deinstitutionalization under Reagan in California, this couple sort of sensed that there was about to be an influx of a population of people that had been stripped of the services that they had relied on. And so they started in their garage, just providing sort of access to art-making materials for a population of sort of whoever wanted to show up. And that was a range of people with different developmental and mental disability. And this is a very, very early photo. It still looks very institutional in that that was sort of the structure that they were responding to and kind of trying to navigate around. We can fast forward to today. This is a photo of the studio. They're in their third location. They went from a garage to a sort of unused space in a state building to now another garage, which was a former mechanic's office and garage where they've converted it into a sort of open air drop-in studio. They serve over 100 artists who can come and are there for life. They are not required to make work if they don't feel so inclined. But if they do want to begin to make art, they have access to all manner of materials. There's a wood shop, ceramic studio, looms, sewing machines, painting, sort of any kind of material that speaks to them. And there are other artists that work there and sort of guide their practice. It's not instruction, it's not therapeutic, it's not classes. It is just a kind of supportive network for artists to find their voice, and through their kind of working through an artistic practice that develops, they can get autonomy, agency, and sort of fulfill a more richer life. And Creative Growth, it is only providing art there. The residents all return home, all the artists return home at the end of the evening, and this has developed since the 70s. There are some artists who've been there now for 40 years or so, and this has become arguably one of the most interesting artist-run kind of artist spaces in the country. And they, in addition to having a studio where artists work, they have a gallery space where they mount exhibitions. They sell work there. It's a setup where any work that is sold, the artist takes 50%, and then Creative Growth takes 50%, if that's a drawing that sells for $10, or if it's a work of art by a well-known artist such as Dan Miller that sells for $50,000. The split is exactly the same. Every month, everyone gets a check, regardless of the amount of the check. And so it is less about a kind of relationship to a market and more about using your art to generate agency and autonomy. And the exhibition at the Art Center is called Creative Growth. And it is a retrospective of the organization. It doesn't seek to, there's a few in-depth presentations of artists who are currently working at the studio, but it really seeks to sort of show the evolution kind of very early on of artists having access basically to paint or markers and paper, and to now where artists are producing multifaceted works of art. Here's a really amazing Painted Suit by William Scott. We have work by Susan Janow, which is a video piece that kind of spans the material history that the artist had access to, and also the kind of concerns that they were facing and making in their work. And it is up through mid-May. We're in Sheboygan, as I said, just about 2 hours north of here. I took a lovely train ride from Milwaukee, which is an hour, so I invite everyone to come up and see the exhibition. And I wanted to back into this exhibition a little and talk about the history of the Art Center for those that aren't familiar with our institution. And we do a lot of things there, but I will talk specifically about my role, which is working primarily on our collection of artist-built environments. And when I was thinking about the ethics, that question of ethics, it really just made me think about curatorial work in general, and not to sort of blow open this discussion too much, but thinking about the work that I do in relation to the artists in our collection. Much of the work that we receive comes to us after the artists have already died, and there's little information about what they had hoped would happen to their work, how they sort of lived their life, what kind of aspects sort of in their control and outside of their control influenced what they were doing. So a lot of the decisions that we make on exhibition of the work and didactics sort of come down to a lot of ethical questions and feelings. And I wanted to just go through a few examples to sort of talk, just to put in mind some of the questions that we and other sort of curators that show work that comes to us in this way face. This is an installation view at the Art Preserve of an artist named Emery Blagden's healing machine. This was a work that he made to cure cancer by harnessing the powers of the earth, that he believed his work made primarily of baling wire, aluminum foil, masking tape, and Christmas wrapping decorations could bring up energy from the within, and if people spent time in there, they could be cured of cancer. And he died. There's nothing left in writing or recording of what he wanted to happen to the healing machine after he died, how he thought of it, if he thought of himself as an artist, if he wanted people to even see this or experience it. We have it all in our collection because of the work of one man who saved it and donated it. And we have installed it in a way, this is definitely not how he had it. We have no photos of how he had it. But we maintain that it is a valuable and viable work of creative expression that needs to be seen, and all we can do is approach it sensitively and responsively to our audiences and to the research that we have. And we have a lot of artists in our collection who sort of lived alternatively in different ways for reasons unknown to us. On the left is an image of Eddie Owens Martin, who invented a religion called Pasakoyanism. He had a vision that he was the first Pasakoyan and needed to create a temple complex in his hometown of Buena Vista, Georgia, where people could come and worship. And he adopted a persona called Saint Ohm, where he created an entire wardrobe and belief system and objects to help him practice this religion. On the right is the artist Loy Bolin, who also adopted the persona, the original rhinestone cowboy, and he covered his entire home in Mississippi in glitter and sequins. He wore fully encrusted suits, played songs, and performed. We own his entire house that's been deconstructed into about 700 pieces. Again, little is known about what he wanted to happen to the house. Would he enjoy people walking through his house without him? It was really his sort of space. But again, we believe it's important and show it in the most respectful way that we can. Another example of an artist, we own basically her entire output. Merrie Knoll, we own the actual property that she lived in Fox Point, Wisconsin, which is completely adorned, floor, ceiling, walls, furniture, in addition to the thousands of works of art that she made, paintings, ceramics, sculptures. We have all of her diaries, we have all of her clothes, we have her receipts for what she bought at the grocery store, what she bought at the hardware store. And we make choices sort of constantly about what we show, how we talk about it, what we present, the narrative that we want people to understand, sort of her entire life's dedication to this one property. And another artist many of you are familiar with, Eugene von Brunkenhain, whose entire practice was dedicated to the love of his wife, Merrie. He took thousands of photographs of her. He made paintbrushes from her hair, which you can see pictured here, which he used to paint hundreds of sort of fantastical and imaginative mythological paintings of space and cells and biology. We knew he wanted to be an artist. We don't know that Merrie would appreciate images of her being circulated in the way that they are. So again, we approach it as best we can with the hard questions that have no answers. And just, I'll leave you with two more current projects, and even with the living artist, things still are not as clear as you might want them to be. This is an artist, Otis Houston Jr., that I just did a show with, who his primary studio and gallery is the side of the FDR Highway in New York, where since 1991 he's been making sculptures and performances. We just did his first museum show at the Art Center. We invited him up to make brand new work in a studio in the basement and take over the gallery, where he did a series of ad hoc performances involving fruit and coconuts and various objects he collected. All kinds of questions remain to be answered about what it meant to take his work out of the practice that he's been working in and put it into a quote-unquote white cube. How will that change its reception? How will it change his practice? Even in the week that we were there, we saw his practice change by his exposure to museum structures and infrastructures and systems. And since he's returned back to Harlem, his work definitely looks dramatically different than it did before he came. And finally, the current project I'm working on is an artist, Kia Tawana. Some of you may know her for the monumental ark on the left that she built in Newark in the 1980s. She was forced to dismantle it in 1987 and lived the rest of her life sort of in transit On the right is a sort of illegally taken photo from a documentary, so don't tell anyone you saw this, of her apartment that she died in, where all of her possessions lived in perfectly built modular units that contained her worldview of these homemade encyclopedias, works of art that she made, writings and drawings. Again, thousands of unanswered questions, many that will never be answered, and we're working on an exhibition now of her work and delving into all kinds of issues of history, identity, access that we can kind of talk about in this conversation. So I look forward to talking to everyone, hearing questions, and kind of delving into some of these, I think, issues of showing art.
I don't really have too many visuals to show you, but I will take this one down. We'll keep this up. Okay, so my name is Vincent Uribe. I'm the director of Level 3. We're an artist-run space and online publication that I founded in 2010, based in Wicker Park here in Chicago. We've been doing year-round exhibition programming to bring community together and focus Chicago artists and have them intermingle with artists from around the country. I've also, in 2013, I joined the team at Arts of Life, which is similar to Creative Growth, a progressive art studio supporting artists with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So my practice as an artist is really bringing people together through various exhibition programs. At Level 3, we focus on small group exhibitions, usually 2 or 3 artists per show, all with this idea of trying to introduce artists to one another who haven't met or worked with each other. And then at Arts of Life, where our program is really focused on supporting artists with disabilities, adult artists. So we have a studio location in Westtown off Carroll and Damon, and then in the North Shore suburbs in Glenview. We're the oldest arts nonprofit in Illinois supporting artists with disabilities, and we could kind of go more into that too, but I'm kind of just want to give some background into the work that I'm involved in as a gallery person working with artists. Oh, that's me. This is me in my Level 3 gallery space. Arts of Life to me is a very, I think when I started working at Arts of Life, I was coming from this setting of art school, working with artists, contemporary artists, and trying to bring in artists to give them a platform to build their career forward. And that's me with Jean Wilson, who's an artist at Arts of Life. A big part of the work at Arts of Life is really providing a voice to our artists and a platform for them to also build their practice forward. So the work at Arts of Life and Level 3, to me, I think initially I was very conflicted of how do these separate programs interrelate, and then as soon as I sort of gave into them, that they're very much entwined with one another and they support one another. I'm very much interested in how we build community and break down these barriers that the art world often has of these, sterile white cube spaces. They're often cold to people if you're not an artist or you're not connected to the art world. So I'm very interested in how do we bring people into the art world who are interested or be that foot into the door and make it more accessible. So with Arts of Life, we have our Circle Contemporary Galleries that we started in 2017, I believe. So each of our we have two 6,000 square foot studios where our artists get to come in and make artwork, and we support their creative practice as working professionals. But then we also have a gallery program where we invite guest curators to come in and work with our curatorial committee of artists. Leslie Baum, who's been in some of our shows before, and I think there's probably some other folks who are here involved. A big part of the exhibition programming, specifically at Arts of Life, is similar to what I'm interested in doing at Level 3, where we're bringing artists together, trying to, maybe forge these community connections. So our guest curators, who are often artists, mostly local artists, get to work with our curatorial committee of artists with disabilities. They get to go through and do studio visits and go through all the artwork that we have that we support about 60 artists with disabilities, so they could kind of see the vast range of mediums and subject matters that we support. And then hopefully they're gonna bring in their community of artists and curate a show that's an integrated group show. So when I joined Arts of Life, it was really important that to me, what stood out to me the most was the artwork, really. As much as I love the people and the environment, it's the artwork that really spoke to me. So I wanted to make sure that the artwork could be seen as contemporary artwork and not just as this is artwork made by somebody with a disability and that's why I'm gonna support it. We're really excited. At the end of this month, we're gonna be making our Miami debut during Art Basel, participating in 2 fairs. And so we're gonna be representing 7 of our artists at 2 different project sites in Miami, and are looking to kind of further this dialogue of artists with disabilities getting represented within the broader art community. And so I'm gonna kind of just keep it at that so we could get into the conversation a little bit more, but yeah.
Hello, my name is Irene Haynes. I'm a member of Threshold South. I'm an artist with mental illness. I don't know what else was I supposed to say. Oh, I make abstract art. You can see some of my pieces up there on the screen. It's downstairs in the art gallery, Thresholds Art Gallery. That's actually abstract bird. That one is the wings of life. Let's see, what else? There's another one on here. That's just a horizon. Let's see. Oh. I use anything from pencils to markers to paint. I try to, I also use various kinds in one piece. I'll use markers and pencils and colored pencils in the same sketching. So I really try to be diverse about what I put into my art pieces. I just started doing art maybe since I've been at Thresholds. And so I've been there about 10 years. And it's been a joy and a wonder. It's uplifted my soul. It's shown me a new place in my life to express myself. I have more peace in my heart, in my soul, in my mind. I feel more connected to my community. It's shown me a way to express myself without anger or rage, but with peace and love and security. when my mind is scattered because of my schizophrenia, it helps me have calmness and be able to express myself without words and still be not locked up within my depression or my calamity, but having security and reassurance that I can be a part of society without being a desperation for staying away because someone might be scared of me. You're doing great. Thank you. Thank you. I didn't think my artwork was that good, but I have my ups and my downs. About these coins, I was just trying to say. The gathering of the history of life and how the declaration of the different presidents through the years, how their memories are always continual. And that's how art is. It leaves an expression for other people. And this art piece you see on the screen right here shows that there's more than one planet people are looking at in the sky. The sun and the way the Earth has moved through the galaxy some, like they told on the news on TV. It's like a marking of a new time. More space, more things to see in the sky, more things to look forward to learn about the universe and going to the planetarium, the Shed Aquarium, the Museum of Fuel Museum, so many things in Chicago, where I'm from, born and raised. It's good that you don't take all your time to just move around all the time. It looks like everybody is running down the street in their cars all the time, where I don't feel hurt or painful that I don't have a car anymore, because I can sit down and express myself with words since I know how to read. And I have to go back to school and school myself, because what has been given can be taken back because of not earning what you have. And people just do not understand. I didn't think about that till lately. Yeah. Because I was like, I didn't read all the books I was supposed to read when I was in high school. Yet I got my diploma. Now I'm on the ACTS team at Thresholds, ACTS team. So I'm thinking, what are they about, ACTS? The ACTs. That's what the high school curriculum test. So I have to make sure I have the list of high school books to read and read them. So I'm reading Catcher in the Rye right now, Catcher in the Rye. It'd be nice to just write a story in art. And that's what pictures are like. It's a story being written. If you can't read the words, then read the lines. The mind of expression was a thought of an internal insight. That's all I have to say right now.
I got it. Thank you. All right. Thank you very much. That was a beautiful way to, Irene, for introducing yourself and segueing to some of the questions I have for everyone. If you don't mind, can we continue to hear from you? And the same question will be asked of all the panelists here. Is that okay? All right. So this is just the bigger question about messages in your art. And I read in your introduction and some of the print materials that went out about you also write poetry too, so I'm gonna leave space for that. Okay. But just for each of you, but starting with you, Irene, just about the message that you wanna send through the art, and for the other panelists, this is about the message you wanna send as a way of advocating for those spaces and places for those kinds of artists that you're representing as well. But with you, Irene, what is the message that you wanna send through your art?
That you can appreciate all art, artists, and learn from one another. I used to go on the L stations when they put the art on the L stations around town. And I would ride just to look at the artwork of the different artists in Chicago. And my brother was an artist. He tried to go to the Art Institute, but changed his mind and became a history teacher. My sister was a social worker, and my brother, post office worker. But we all went to college, so I have some college material, but it's fortunately, we all had work, but it's like appreciation where someone could do anything and not have fear, but can express themselves in some way. And everybody can learn from anyone. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Laura, if you can step in and share your viewpoint about messages that you want others to hear or see.
I think just like Irene said, I'm really interested in using artistic expression as a tool to bridge gaps that seem sort of unbridgeable, and in today's world especially. I think I've always been interested in art practices that seek to explain something that hasn't made sense when you look at through history or time. Kind of what you read in the history books, whether it's an art history book or a regular history book, there always seems to be, it's laid out so linearly, but there always seems to be something in between that's not shared there. How did this become that, which we all kind of know to be false? And so I've always been drawn to artists and art that exists on the margins of sort of what we're told to look at, or what we're told is valuable, or even what we're told to be true, or what happened. So I am interested in presenting work by artists and non-artists alike that force questions of why we're told things are the way that they are. And so anything that you look at and maybe you don't understand, or maybe upsets you, or provokes you, inspires you, delights you, I'm always drawn to things that maybe don't make sense in the world that we are told we live in. And I think that that sort of work comes often from places where you're told artwork doesn't exist. And so that's kind of the work that I always want to put forward and show in exhibitions I work on and artists I work with.
Thank you. Katie, if you can step in.
Okay. Yeah, building on that, I think I too am really interested in art that challenges different kinds of normativity. Very much thinking about what you just said, Laura, about the way that we learn history, the way that we learn and inherit these kind of categories and hierarchies that define cultural production, and that really inculcate us with ideas about who an artist is and what one needs to be an artist. So at the High, we, in pre-COVID times, bring close to 60,000 school children through the museum every year. And my hope is that through the galleries that I have the privilege to curate, they see things that not only potentially inspire them about what their own potential is in the world, but also teaches them to embrace the people that they may know in their lives who don't appear in books that they may read about who an artist is and what's culturally important, but who are, their grandmother who quilts, or their uncle who carves wood on the side. And so I think that that's what makes me excited about getting to represent the artists who are included in the folk and self-taught art collection and exhibitions that we promote at the High, is this notion that we're broadening people's horizons, not only for their own lives, but also for the lives of those around them, that they can embrace the kind of practices of the people that they know, who are maybe artists deep down inside. And then lastly, I'll just say, too, what inspires me so much about self-taught artists, and part of why I started studying and wanting to be a curator who specializes in them, is the way that for them, art is such often something that they are attracted to at such a young age. Like so many self-taught artists in their personal stories reflect on the fact that from childhood, they knew that they had an affinity for making, for representing. But then, life takes them in a different direction, often because they don't have access and they don't have resources and opportunity to really pursue that natural interest. And it's often only at the end of their lives that they're allowed, that they somehow create this space for themselves to let that artistic practice flourish. And to me, there's nothing more inspiring than that it's never too late, and that one can kind of hold on to this artistic kernel for their whole lives, and then really kind of see it through their own agency come to fruition, even if it's only in the last years or decade of their lives.
Thank you. Yeah, Vincent.
Hi. I think for me, it's a little bit self-serving. I'm a very social person, so I'm interested in how I could develop relationships with artists, and then through those relationships build their practice up and get people to understand their work. And I think between all the artists I work with in various spaces, it's much more about how can I support their practice and push them forward, and hopefully that will land other opportunities for them. And then I think on the other side of that is also how can we make the art world more approachable so that people could, whether it's in a white cube gallery or in a museum or in a backyard space, how do we make people, these art spaces more welcoming to people? And I think through these ways of understanding various exhibition programs and spaces, that art isn't, so many people just think of art as this museum setting, where art is so much more than that.
Right, it's a way of life. I can't imagine being in this world without it, right? All different forms of art. Vincent, I want to continue with you if you're okay, because you said something that struck me around the power of language and communication around this. And you mentioned earlier, correct me if I'm wrong, but the gist of it was that you want the work to be seen as contemporary art versus art created by those with disabilities. And that means something very, very different. You also mentioned in other materials that I've read that that kind of connects to this movement about the disability community rapidly evolving to use identity-first language instead of person-first language. So again, this power of language, if you could talk a little bit more about that with the audience who may not be familiar with this movement.
Yeah, and I'm definitely not a disability expert, and I don't identify as someone with a disability. So first and foremost, but I think as I think I've naturally or forged my way into this scene and this community, and getting to meet artists with many different disabilities and backgrounds and interests in their making. Arts of Life is an organization that primarily supports artists with intellectual and developmental disabilities. The way that we want to, there's different trends that kind of happen between, there's a lot of disability advocates who want to hold on to the terms or the disabilities that they associate with, and that I think there's varying viewpoints on like how that language gets used. So person first language, meaning saying an artist with a disability versus a disabled artist, and so I think for Arts of Life, it's important that we take into consideration the artist population that we support and what they're interested in, how they're interested in being represented. And the majority of our artists prefer person-first language. There's a lot of disability advocates who, want to kind of like reclaim those identity terms, if it's Down syndrome or, schizophrenia or whatever the specific disability is, and kind of hold power in those. But, I think it's very important to be considerate of how the individual wants to identify and not make these assumptions for folks.
Yeah, that's. Thank you for saying that. I want to open it up to the other panelists as well to comment on that if you have anything to say. But again, the power of language, especially as it relates to ethics, is so important because the way we conceptualize, the way we talk about things, and the way we educate people about language can help some ways around ethics to help artists in different communities, in the one that we're talking about today, individuals with disabilities or disabled individuals, whichever way we go, right? To feel included, right? To say that this is real art, just irrespective of your training and irrespective if you didn't go to the SAIC, right. We have a reputation. So anyways, I want to open up to the others about this movement, if you have any comment or opinions about it.
Well, I think it's also I think oftentimes this conversation has come up because it's non-disabled folks being the ones who are trying to make these changes happen. And so I think it's just, being more aware of who we're talking about and what they want is, I think, first and foremost, the approach that we tend to take with Arts of Life, at least.
Yeah, and I think thinking about autonomy and agency and what that looks like and how that is sort of defined, and I like the title of this Artist First, I think is how I'm not an artist at all, but I am drawn to working with artists, and in all of the work that I do, I always try as best I can to be artist first, and if that means not getting to say everything that as a curator I want to say, not getting to show the work that I want to say, or that I want to show because the artist, doesn't love that painting, or the artist wants to remain anonymous, or the artist doesn't want people to know that they live in Wisconsin. These are all things that I've dealt with art, and I think that it is kind of being okay with not knowing and not telling and not showing everything, which is kind of counter to art history and research and museum presentations, that it's okay to sort of leave some things unsaid. Again, Kate and I were talking earlier at breakfast about sometimes leaving things unsaid is a choice also, and leaves open the possibility for people to fill in their own blanks, which are sometimes not what you want. But I think, as Vincent said, it's always important to, if you're going to commit to showing the work of an artist, you have to commit to showing the work of that artist. And it's not about making another argument or making a point that you want to make. It really has to come from what the artist wants and needs in the context in which they want their work shown and viewed.
I like what you were saying earlier too, with some of the things in your guys' collection that, I think also understanding that sometimes, especially for artists who have passed away, where we don't have that history or that record of what they want or what their intent was, is at least being able to understand that, recognize that, and then, we do as best as we can to support artists. And I think, it's speaking to the conversation title, like the artist versus really, we could only do as much as we can.
Yeah, we think, at least I think a lot about, with our collection and all the work I do, the unknown versus the unknowable. And I think there are some things that we could do a lot of research and learn, and there are some things that we will never know, no matter what we read and who we ask and where we look. And I think that is really easy to think about with artists who are no longer living, because you're making all those choices. But I also think applying that to working with artists who are living and still working, there are things that are unknown that you can ask and learn, and there are things I will never know what it feels like to live in another person's experiences, and that sometimes you just have to leave the unknowable and kind of find the magic in the things that you never will know.
Well said. Yep. And I think I'll add an example, because at the High, because we're such a large museum and artists, the department that I represent is one of 7, and there has to be some kind of parity between the folk and self-taught artists in my collection and the 17th century European artists that we're presenting in the European galleries, or the unidentified African artists working, in the Congo in the 1900s. So it's just, one challenge that I have in my role is that there's kind of institutional approaches to the capital A artists, right? Who that category somehow has to encompass all these different kinds of individuals working at all different times across history in different cultural contexts. And that can be really difficult. And it can be difficult to negotiate with the fact that we have the kind of same services across the institution for all of these different collections and all of these different exhibitions that we each bring in. And an example I'll give is a number of years ago, we presented the exhibition organized by the National Gallery of Art, Outliers in American Vanguard Art, that was an incredibly ambitious show that really tracked the kind of influence that self-taught artists have had, including many self-taught artists who did have developmental disabilities and mental illness challenges, and the impact that these artists have had on trained artists over the course of the century. And it was a massive show, more than 300 objects, more than 70 artists represented, and our docent corps was really challenged by the fact that I wouldn't put red dots on the labels to show who was self-taught and who wasn't, which is not something that the National Gallery did or that LACMA did, the other venues for the show, of course. But at the High, because we have this kind of, I don't want to say segregated, because something I didn't talk about is, since 2018, when we reinstalled our permanent collection galleries, I'm very committed to showing self-taught artists in conversation with artists across our collection, regardless of their background, their training, even what century they were working in. I think it's very important moving forward that self-taught artists are integrated and put into different kinds of conversation with artists who maybe were trained. So all to say that was a challenge that I faced around language, around methodologies of presentation, and that I face every day. And so we each come from different contexts. We work in different kinds of institutions and communities. And I think we all have to be thoughtful about how we approach these kinds of questions, for sure.
Okay, so let's continue to talk about that. I think, when I think of ethics, what comes to mind is a million things, but in this particular situation that you're bringing up, that process of consent, minimizing harm, confidentiality, being anonymous, but there's another aspect that involves the negotiation of decision making. So where are the artists empowered to help influence the policies of museums? How do we empower and support?
I think it's hard if it's living artists, starting with them. Mm-hmm. I think that I think that's what you're doing often with the artists that you're working. And I think, it's a very tricky I guess I've only really worked with living artists, so I don't know how to, and I think that I'm only really interested in working with living artists because I'm interested in that relationship and like really, you know, again, I think I'm thinking about it in this conversation itself, like I want to be friends with everyone. So like it feels very personal to me there, but.
I can think, I work with both living artists and artists that are no longer with us, and I commission new work from artists. So I kind of work across arenas, but I shared a little about the most recent project I did with Otis Houston Jr., and it was a fascinating sort of leap of faith by my institution, and not to bore you with, you know, how museums function, but typically you have to have a checklist, you know, at least 6 months in advance, sometimes years, and you have massive conversations about how you're going to install a work of art and what is the mount and what is you know, on and on and on and on. And Otis, we had another artist who needed to delay an exhibition, so we had an empty gallery for 4 months, and Otis and I had already been talking about doing something, and I sort of said, hey, you know, Otis, like, do you want to come do a show? You can come for a week. We'll just do it. And we didn't have a checklist. We didn't know what he was going to make. We didn't know how we were going to install it. We had no didactics. We had no marketing tagline. None of the things that we needed to have. But we had no other choice because we were going to have an empty gallery. So we all sort of, you know, looked into each other's eyes, took the leap of faith. And I think that Otis will talk really openly about his practice on the FDR, where he has, you know, 2.5 million visitors every day, which every museum would kill for. His audience comes from all different places, all different walks of life, all different backgrounds, which also most museums are really striving for. His work's ephemeral, so you don't have to worry about storing it. You know, it's in many ways a sort of perfect artistic practice to destroy everything that a museum cares about. And so bringing him in and then kind of negotiating our best practices in our role was trying to serve artists the best that we can. Actually, all the things that we wanted to do to serve the work the best were counter to what Otis actually needed to be supported as an artist. And I think that it was a really powerful and important moment for the museum that's actually now occasioned a rethinking of some of the ways that we think about the not stagnant, but kind of more set art objects in our collection. How we can open them up a little bit more, how you know, how our galleries should actually be more like the side of the road, like what parts of that can we bring in, and how can we kind of knock down those walls. And so I think that it is not being scared, that the museum should listen to the artist rather than, you know, having the artist kind of have to fit their practice into the museum. And if more institutions were doing that, and again, artists first, listening to artists, I think all museums would actually be better and more interesting.
Yeah. Irene, can I ask just your personal experience about your process of choosing the pieces and working with thresholds and working with the Artists First committee on displaying your work? How was that for you? Did you feel like you had equal say or the final decision even, what was going to be displayed in the museum?
Well, it was more equal. I saw what was going to be displayed. She asked me if it was okay, and I agreed. Yeah. I had some artwork. Leslie Baum showed on the internet, and we had there was an art walk. You have it every year. Where is it at? Ravenswood Art Walk. Yeah, where all the Thresholds members around the city has the art pieces, like 4 pieces up each. And people get the opportunity to buy the art or look at the art. And it's nice. Yeah.
And you feel like if you ever do not want to show your work, then you feel like you can comfortably decline the offer?
Well, it's never been no time I didn't want to show the work. Sometimes I'm shocked the work is being seen, because sometimes I don't know which work is going to be up. Because Actually, some of the artwork that came on the screen, I was like, what? That's not even downstairs. It's not in the building. So, yeah, but, you know, what you might not think is good art to you might be good art to someone else. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Okay, I think I have just one last question, and then we can open up for Q&A, and then maybe we can go back to some additional questions if we have time. One big question, I'm again thinking about representation in the art community. Again, the self-taught artists, the ones who get the formal degrees and training, and again, those who are disability identified, in particular that we're focusing on for today. But even with disability identified, there could be intersections of those identities. And those intersections could further marginalize individuals, such as someone who has a disability identified as either mental health or neurodevelopmental, and being a person who could be of color or a person of a minority sexual identity. What practices are put in place to really uplift those marginalized identities within the disability identified community as it comes to presenting the art, and who values it, and who makes the decisions of what's being shown or not?
I guess for us, I mean, I try to be as conscious as I can, and I feel within all of my exhibition programming that I try to be as aware of the makeup of, like, I don't do solo shows for the sole reason that I want artists to come together and meet, and so I'm very much interested in like how to pair artists together, and so that often is considering, you know, their background, how they identify, what the medium is, but then also for us when we're thinking about exhibition programming, we have a curatorial committee that we consult with. I think there's often a lot of like internal knowledge that like I'm aware of, and our guest curators that we work with, we're often trying to like educate them about, you know, maybe your instinct is to show this one artist, but this artist is shown like a handful of times recently, and they might not be aware of that. So like being able to like also guide our curators with the knowledge that I have, I think is also important. And you know, I think similar kind of what you were saying, how I'm really happy to hear that you were sort of pushing back when teams are wanting to identify very specifically, and especially in institution settings, because like you know, there's this blurry line of, you know, we want to educate the general public, especially in these like larger institution settings, but also, you know, we don't need to segregate out folks by these disabilities or non-disabilities, because as you're saying, like some people might like the work and some people aren't, and you know, it's first and foremost artwork, and I think that's kind of where I come from, I think, as like also the artist perspective.
Thank you. Others, if you have any comment about that?
Sure. Something that the High's been doing for a number of years that I think has both good and bad things around it is that we've been putting photographs of artists on our labels. So with the kind of information that we provide on what's called a tombstone in museum speak, which is like the artist's name, birth year, maybe also death year if they're deceased, medium, you know, title of the artwork, that basic information about the artwork. Whenever possible, both contemporary historical artists, we include some kind of depiction of them, which takes like the need for some kinds of language that may describe things like gender identity or race. I mean, none of these things are completely visible, of course, but it in theory was supposed to create a kind of a way that we are treating artists across the collection without making distinctions between the different collections, and how we identify artists and what kinds of biographical information we may or may not be including about them in their extended labels. And so I think that in that way, that was something that makes sense. People also like to see artists, you know, they like to see a face of a person. It reminds them that there was an individual behind this object. It humanizes the artwork on that level. But I think it also creates other kinds of problems, and we can kind of talk about that, including, that these kinds of identity markers are not always visible, assumptions can be made. It also creates issues around artist consent, because especially for deceased artists, we don't have consent to use images of them in the way that we are. So there's kind of pluses and minuses, again, on this policy. But I think, for one thing, the fact that it's institution-wide is good, because it means that every artist who's being presented has this kind of common denominator of being presented visually, in our exhibition didactics.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to go into the Q&A because some of these questions are right in the way with what we're talking about. So to the panel, so where is the art community at in terms of issues artists with disabilities face? For example, political, socioeconomic, mental health issues. Are there plans, so there's a couple of questions. Where is the art community at in terms of issues artists with disabilities face? Are there plans for the future to incorporate more artists from unique backgrounds on a more national and global scale? So this is another question that kind of dovetails with what we're talking about already.
I think it's definitely come along. I mean, the October issue of Art in America, I don't know if people here received that publication or sort of are, but it is, a definitive publication. And the October issue was all about artists with disabilities and the long history of that. They had, multiple perspectives of different artists working, timelines, histories, and not that says, everything's arrived, but that this kind of new awareness that is in line with the art world sort of facing a reckoning of its really problematic history of who it kind of highlights and considers an artist. So I think I'll say Tom DiMaria, for those who don't know, is the longtime director of creative growth. He gave a presentation that I saw a little bit ago, just super briefly saying, Judah Scott's one of the most famous artists that came out of creative growth. She was born with Down syndrome, in the 1940s. When she was a fraternal twin. When she was 6, her parents were advised to institutionalize her. So she was taken from her twin sister in the middle of the night and put into an institution where they didn't know that she was deaf, so she never learned to communicate in that way. Fast forward, her sister found her, sort of deinstitutionalized her, brought her to creative growth, where she had an incredible career, international exhibitions, highly collected. And fast forward to today, we're a young creative growth artist named Eli Cooper, who kind of grew up with creative growth. He's in his 20s. Judith Scott is one of his artistic idols and mentors. And so Tom said how far we've come since 1940 to 2022, where an artist with Down syndrome can look at another artist with Down syndrome and try to mirror their very successful career off of the path that they've been able to forge. And I think that is incredible and speaks volumes to how far we've come, but still sort of how much work there is to be done in terms of democratizing the art world in general.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
All right, thank you. All right, so another question. How can audiences better support and participate and empower artists with disabilities and mental health challenges? So I'm assuming maybe people who come to, if anybody who's here want to clarify the question a little bit more for me, but I'm assuming the audience, meaning the ones who are visiting to see the artwork, possibly, as the audience, or this audience?
Yeah, I mean, like my mind's going a few different directions, and I feel like we're also just touching on like a very quick surface of this conversation, and I know we could probably talk for hours on it, and I think we're going to hang out for a bit afterwards and welcome more of these discussions, because I think it has to start somewhere. I think if for these conversations as like a starting point for us to understand the issues that like we, no one's perfect, and I think that's often one of the challenges that institutions, organizations, curators, gallerists, whoever face, is being able to feel like you're not always doing the wrong thing. And so I think there's a lot of hesitation often with working with I guess I'll say our population of artists with disabilities, because people don't want to say or do the wrong thing. But I think the more transparent and more open and there's, ask the question that's on your mind. If it's inappropriate, we'll tell you. And like, it's not something that we're not going to hold that against you. So I think the more that we could talk about this openly, why is, person first language versus identity first, there's, it changes depending on the situation. So I think, I encourage the audience to ask those questions, but also be considerate, and I think there's a level of like care that has to take place in these conversations, but also you're not always right. Also, I think when it goes back to artists first, it's like, what does the artist want, and how can we put that power and ownership back on the artist? So I mean, there's more things that we could get into in terms of funding, and if paying artists, and how to pay artists with disabilities if they have funding from the state, and what that would mean for them. And there's like a slew of topics that we could go into, but I'll just leave it at that.
And I think for an audience too, I think, and I can only, I learn every day in my job from artists, which is one of my favorite things about the work that I'm privileged to do. But I do think sometimes the question that comes into your mind, it's good to take a step back and think, what do I actually want to know?
Yeah.
What am I trying to ask? And if it is about the work or it's about the artist. And I think, I love people. I think people are endlessly fascinating. So I want to ask, often people are like, whoa, I can't believe you're asking me that. We just met. But I really want to get into what makes people work and think and how they move in the world, which is why I like art, because it feels like you get to look into someone's kind of secret inner workings. And that's also beautiful. So I think it's about really learning yourself too, and doing some work and some research and some reading, and trying to understand what about art you want to know. And if you do find yourself sort of consistently drawn to work made by artists with a disability, kind of understand why, like what about it, what about the actual aesthetics of the work draws you to it, so that you can sort of learn how to learn what you want to know in a way that feels respectful, but also sort of quenches your curiosity. And I don't think curiosity is ever a bad thing. It's just about learning the best way to share your curiosity with others.
Irene, can I ask you a question, just following up on that? Audiences, how do you think you want audiences to support artists that are similar to you or like you?
Well, I would want the audience to be open-minded about what the expression the artist is trying to give, just to appreciate the art, and the real meaning behind what was drawn. Not necessarily to buy it all the time, but to understand the expression, and just be honest with yourselves, and honest with the artist. That's everybody has the opportunity and the appreciation of what you choose to like, maybe as a gift or as their own experience. That's all.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so another question for the panel. For artists who have passed away or do not have immediate family, how is any profit that might come from these artists' work usually handled? And then part 2, are there ethical considerations surrounding this topic to ensure that any profit made from these works is being used in a way that best honors the artist? So how is the financial aspect of it usually handled? And then what are the ways any profit made from this is supporting or honoring the artist that's deceased? Katie, let's start with you. If that's okay.
Yeah, I mean, at the High, we don't pay artists for exhibitions, and that's normal for institutions like the High. It's not a place, it's not a gallery, it's not a place where artists are showing their work and getting, selling it or getting remunerated for the exhibition that's taking place. So we, in terms of exhibitions, if like for George Voronovsky, for instance, who I'm doing a show of in March, we are not, benefiting financially from that exhibition apart from sharing it with our public and getting admission fees, that are paid by the public to come see the work. But that, of course, goes to our operating costs. So there's not like a pathway that leads to an artist, whether they're alive or deceased, in terms of the financial model that most museums use for exhibitions. For acquisitions, when we're actually buying a work of art, it's different. And in that case, yes, we would be working with the estate, the descendants of an artist who have a legal claim to the kind of estate of that artist, for sure. But it's not, I think people think that there's more like money changing hands with institutional exhibitions and acquisitions than there necessarily is, because the other thing is that the vast majority of our collection is built through gifts. And so we're not, in fact, paying for the art that we're receiving. It's coming via the generosity of donors who've already purchased the work, remunerated the artist or the artist's estate in some way. So I think there is a little bit of a misunderstanding. I often find that people think that museum exhibitions come with compensation, and in fact, in most cases they do not.
And we're all nonprofits too, so I think that's a little bit of a distinction. I think it's a little bit different in like the commercial art market. There's a handful of commercial galleries that do represent artists who have deceased, and I don't know if I could speak to them, but I think, just to clarify, like as nonprofits, I think we handle those kinds of things probably a little bit differently than like the general commercial gallery space.
Right. So speaking of the different, because we're coming from more of a community-oriented gallery space, if that's correct to say, and then we're coming from, I've been to the High Museum many, many times when I lived in Atlanta and then visiting family in Atlanta, so I love that place. And then we have another museum in Wisconsin, right? So this question, so the processes, I think this person is, I think, behind this, I think the intention of this question is definitely focused more towards the more institutional practices of museums. So Laura and Katie, this question is for both of you. How are disabled artists or those in disabilities or those who identify with disabilities involved in the ethical discussions of the practice, I'm assuming the work that's going to be shown in the museum? So how is the community, how is the community with people with disabilities, how are they involved in these conversations, these ethical conversations with the High Museum and the other museum?
Well, for instance, I'm working with an artist now. Again, it's a physical disability that she has, but she's very much a partner in our discussions around an acquisition of her work that I'm working on. Her name's Marquetta B. Johnson. She's an incredible quilter who's been a teaching artist with the High Museum as well for many, many years. And so she's been a kind of key partner for the museum, not just as an artist whose work we admire, but as an artist who's actively facilitating workshops, including many with people in the disability community. Especially, we have a kind of partnership with the Center for the Visually Impaired in Atlanta. So, she's a partner when it comes to doing something like acquiring her work. We've made that selection together based on, a lifetime of quilts that she's made and how she holds them close to her and the meaning that each has to her. And we've worked together on a selection that I think both represents the kind of larger goals that I have for the museum collection, which includes better representation of Black American quilters, which is a kind of area of the collection that we're surprisingly kind of not very deep in. And then, Marquetta's own personal practice and how she regards the quilts that she's made over decades and the different kinds of touch points that each one has had for her in representing a particular milestone in her career. So that's just one example, but I think it's probably, I'm sure you will give a very specific example too, because it's not, the disability community is not a monolith, obviously, and we work with artists in different ways, and so it's always a kind of case-specific thing.
Yeah, and I think the art center where I work is really different than most museums in a lot of ways, and that's kind of by design, but also sort of from our leadership. And one of the ways that we use exhibitions at the art center is to learn about things that we don't know or that we don't think we're doing very well. And so the decision to approach creative growth about organizing the retrospective was an intentional one, in which we wanted to be a better partner to a community in Sheboygan that we have had a sort of relationship with, but certainly it's never been, it just kind of happened organically. There's a local organization called RCS Empowers, and part of what they do is they do have an art program, but it's mainly focused and towards getting people with disabilities, intellectual, mental, and physical, sort of into the workforce. And so it's a lot of job training. And they expressed an interest a few years ago in how to help some of their participants use art as a viable career path. And so that sort of occasioned this idea of, let's find an organization that's done that very successfully, which was Creative Growth. And so from the beginning of the Creative Growth Project, we've brought in RCS board members and participants. We host their monthly art club is hosted at the Art Center now. So they go into the exhibition, they use our resources. We've sort of, we're on year 3 of this sort of more intentional collaboration and partnership, bringing their participants into all of the galleries and figuring out how we can sort of better host them, what the resources are that they need to feel comfortable, both the staff and their participants while they're there, and sort of how, we could help sell some of the work of the participants in our store and helping them set up a structure, as Vincent was saying, that sort of doesn't impede with some of the other sources of funding that their participants get. And so I think that, again, it's kind of acknowledging that we don't know, and we also don't know how to know without asking the people that do know. So that was what really prompted the Creative Growth show, was this desire to know and learn from an organization in our community that's already doing some of the work that we want to do, and them acknowledging that we're doing some of the work that they want to do. And I always think that's kind of the best way to make a change in that way.
Okay, thank you. All right, we have a number of questions. This is a very hot topic. Continuing on with ethics. Vincent, this question is for you. Can you talk about the funding streams that support Arts for Life, and how does, if any, does the government support, or any type of local or national government or funding streams, federal funding streams that might support the work that you do?
So yeah, Arts of Life, we are a pay-for-service organization. So about half of our funding does come from the state. Our artists who qualify for disability funding, we bill per the hours that we support them, and then we support them for extra hours as well. And then we have grants, foundation support, individual giving, events. We do sell artwork, and all of our artwork is for sale from our artists. Our artists get 60% of their sales. So that's a fairly small percentage of our budget, but it's a wide range of funding that supports the organization.
Okay. Mm-hmm. All right. Another question. I think this could be briefly answered possibly, but then there's a part 2 that I'll read as well. So what percentage, or how aware are you that the artists are aware of themselves of having a disability, again, neurodevelopmental, developmental, or mental health disability, that you have worked with or have studied?
We have a full spectrum of artists, and I think that's one of the things that I think, to me, has set Arts of Life apart, is that, we have artists who you might look at them and you could see their disability, and then others that you would have no idea. And so, some of our artists are, and that's why we have these conversations with them, and most of them prefer the person first identity. but I think it's, I think we just have a pretty wide spectrum.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. How aware, what percentage do you guys see that the artists are aware of their own disability?
I
If
think
they are.
we're probably in pretty similar situations because of how we represent this broader field of self-taught art. And in so many cases, it's if they have a disability, it's actually undiagnosed, and so to the extent that they're aware, I couldn't say, but it's, as many people I think in this audience know, a kind of family within the self-taught art world is the visionary, and artists who have these kind of this connection to the divine realm, this ability to see beyond the natural and man-made built environments. And those kinds of things are really ubiquitous across the field of self-taught art. And most of those artists, wouldn't identify as having any kind of developmental disability or even, thinking in that space. And we wouldn't put that label on them either, but I think what can be said is that there's just so many artists who are dealing with access to alternative realities, right? And to the extent to which we can put language around that in a form of diagnosis is, really, really limited, and it's not something that we would necessarily want to do. But we do have to acknowledge that there's this kind of this worldview that is, again, non-normative in some way, and I guess we would acknowledge it in that way.
Mm-hmm. And into that vein, what are the ways that practices or ethics are put in place so that those, again, whether they are aware of their disability or not, it doesn't matter. The art is going to be the same, right? Regardless of a label. But at the same point, how are they protected from misrepresentation and not being put on display, not being sensationalized?
Well, fundamentally, they're put on display. And so we were talking about this earlier this morning too. That's where you run into this paradox or kind of clash between wanting to make people who have these non-normative experiences visible, right, and part of our cultural norms and part of our cultural realities, and reorient the norm, as a result of that. But then the flip side of that is you are putting them on display and you are opening up these possibilities for private things, for private experiences, to be, publicized in this way and experienced. And to Laura's point earlier about things that are kind of unknowable, where we can't provide clear answers, we maybe don't want to provide clear answers, that certainly opens up to misinterpretation by the audience, right? The unknowable is this beautiful thing that we can kind of leave space for, but when you leave space for it, you're also creating space for potential misinterpretation. And so I think that it's a fundamental kind of paradox, that lies within the work that we're trying to do of wanting to create visibility, wanting to create empathy and connection between artists and audiences today and future generations, and also being mindful that very act, right, of moving an artist's work and their life into a gallery setting, there's some violence is too strong, but there's there are some dangers that you are creating there as well.
And I think all artists who share their work with others are opening themselves up to some sort of judgment or criticism. Like Irene said, some people like art, some people don't. And I think that for any artist, I think the act of being an artist to begin with is one of the utmost courage and bravery to make something and put yourself out there. So I am constantly in awe of any person that does that in sort of any way. And so I think that, as Vincent was saying earlier, I think a lot of this attempt around language and this fear of putting someone, making a spectacle of someone comes from people that don't identify as disabled wanting to do something right, and that the kind of overthinking of showing that work that maybe you don't do when you're working, with an artist who doesn't upfront express, hey, or doesn't upfront sort of identify sort of differently. I think that when you show any work, you are kind of running the risk of opening someone up and putting someone on display in a way that's not helpful. Or, you know, I've worked with artists who've had really awful experiences showing work just because it wasn't received the way they wanted it to be received, and some of them have stopped making work after. And that's just kind of, I think, part of being vulnerable in that way. And so you always do the best you can to protect everyone involved, but knowing that sometimes its work's received in a way that it wasn't intended to be, I'd say.
Okay, thank you. So I know I have just one comment that I want to read from a viewer, person in the audience here, and this is for Irene. But before then, I think there's so many important questions on the Q&A. I think the question around the art, the cost of art, how art is priced. I think the viewer online is kind of questioning about that people with disabilities, her experience or that person's experience, they see artists with disabilities, their work is priced far lower compared to those non-temporarily disabled people. So I think that'd be great to talk about after.
Yeah, that's a whole nother conversation. We could have another few hours just on that.
But I wanted to
would
put
love
it out there in case, because I think that's important to talk about in terms of the ethics. So the person in the audience writes here, I want to thank Irene for bringing up the one thing that most people don't realize about those of us with mental illness. Our major fear in life is that once you learn of our disability, you will fear us or avoid any deeper relationship based on public stigma and misconception. Mental illness runs on a spectrum that is rarely discussed. That's very true. So I resonate with what you were saying to Irene. That stuck with me as well. And thank you for the person in the audience to bring that up. That mental illness is nothing to be afraid of, right?
Right.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you all for joining us for this fascinating session. Please join us on December 10th for the next session. And importantly, please visit the Artists First exhibition on view here at the Cultural Center in the Michigan Avenue Gallery's first floor east. For those on site, we have this space until hour, so please feel free to meet our speakers in person. And thank you so much for joining us, and have a wonderful day.